Good evening. My name is Jerry Mitchell. Welcome to MCIR Live. I'm the founder of the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting, and we're so tickled you could join us tonight. And I'm tickled to be here with this all-star panel, talk about hate, what America faces. And MCIR Live is possible because of you, your support, your donations. So we thank you for supporting panels like these and investigative stories that we publish. I have to mention our latest story, which told the story of how a mother and son both died in police custody years apart after being restrained in a way condemned by the Justice Department. And so to get that story out to lots of people, we partnered with the Marshall Project and NBC News. And it's now been read by more than 320,000 people on NBC News alone. So it continues to be shared over social media. And so you'll find all of our great stories at MississippiCIR.org. And if you support our work this month, your donation of up to $1,000 will be tripled. I sound like a salesman, don't I? Yeah, which I'm not. But we'll start with introducing Greg, who's in his really cool recording studio tonight. In fact, what's the next gig, Greg? When are y'all doing the next gig?
The Remainders will be playing in Nantucket sometime this coming summer, I think, summer of this year. So our gigs are few and far between. Yeah, this is the music project, something I do with some other buddies of mine from the past, mostly.
You have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello, everybody.
Yeah, so Greg has, written 17 New York Times bestsellers that began with Spandau Phoenix, and most recently he wrote a trilogy that started with, I have to have a copy of it, the Natchez Burning, and anyway, which features a fictional character based on our next guest, whom he precipitously killed off, I might add.
Yes, violently and precipitously. Yeah, in the first one. Yeah, sorry, Stanley.
Exactly. But people ask me all the time, Jerry, say, "Boy, that's terrible what Greg did in the book." And I said, "Well, look, I know, but I'm a
character and then kills you off."
But I said I'm feeling a lot better now. So
well, that's good. The Mark Twain thing, your death's been exaggerated.
Oh my God.
And this is Stanley's book, which is a new book, Clan of Devils. And of course, Stanley is, Nelson is a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his work on the Frank Morris case, and longtime editor of the award-winning Concordia Sentinel in Faraday, Louisiana. And like I said, and now the author of 2 books, not just 1 book, 2 books. Very good. You'll catch up with Greg one day, maybe.
I won't live that long, no.
Yes, you will. Yes, you will.
Yeah. And I have no doubt that our next guest, who's sitting next to me, Collen Jefferson, is going to be an author soon. She started the law firm Julian, which is named after her mentor, Julian Bond. Now, how many people out there can say Julian Bond was their mentor? We're all very jealous. So, and she's recently taking on a very fascinating case. It's basically a modern day lynching in Mississippi, and we're anxious to hear more about that. And I think it was appropriate to start with Stanley. What made you decide to kind of pursue these cases, Stanley? You began this obviously years ago.
Yeah, well, I had always had an interest in figuring out things about the Klan, but really it began in 2007 after the Justice Department announced they were going to reopen their cases. And I wrote one story just mentioning Frank Morris. I heard about him that day, wrote a little short story for the Sentinel and thought that would be it. A few days later, I got a phone call from Rosa Williams, who was Frank Morris's granddaughter. And she lived in Las Vegas, and someone had sent her a copy of the Sentinel. And she called to tell me that that little short article I had written, which was some 40 plus years at the time after the murder. She was 12 years old at the time. And she said, I learned more in that one article than I've known in the past 4.5 decades. And I just couldn't believe that. It just floored me. And so she, remembered the night her grandfather was killed and hearing the grown-ups talking out at the kitchen table, and she was in her room by herself. And didn't know what to do or what to think, and also realized that I, working at the newspaper, had never heard of Frank Morris, and I thought, how could that be? If the newspaper doesn't know, how many other people don't know? And so mostly it was Rosa Williams and her, I really sort of empathized with what she had been through and tried to figure out how this could happen. And so that was my inspiration as to how I started.
Oh, tell us, I mean, to me, one of the most fascinating things that you've uncovered and done so much reporting on, and obviously goes beyond just one case, is the Silver Dollar Group. Talk a little bit about that group and what they were like and what they did.
Yeah. Well, they were all Klansmen who had been a member of there were 2 or 3 clans around at that time. And they were all violent prone. Many of them had already committed acts of violence. They were, I guess, super racist and really hated Black people, and they just were not going to have civil rights and integration of the schools primarily. And they got real disgusted with the traditional Klan, didn't think that they were accomplishing anything, that, the civil rights movement kept marching along and nothing was happening to stop it. And so they just decided to go underground, and led by this one man named Red Glover, who had a background in explosives. He was a Navy Seabee in the Seabees, and he had this really just violent hatred of Black people. And he recruited his members one by one. And, the whole goal was to do whatever it took to stop civil rights and to stop integration. And they were good criminals. They were good at keeping their mouths shut. People were afraid of them. Klansmen were afraid of them, and everybody was afraid of Red Glover. And so, and I remember the first report, the FBI report I read about him, it described the Silver Dollar Group as a clan within a clan, and I had never heard that term before. And the Silver Dollar name come from Red Glover, who had, when he initiated his new members, he brought them in himself, and he would hand, particularly the early recruits, a silver dollar that was minted in the year that they were born. Wow. And so that's how it kicked off.
And obviously, Greg, go to you now. You read about Stanley's reporting and decided you would do something on it as well.
I had initially I'd written about World War II and Germany and the Holocaust, which was where I was born, but my people were from the South. I'd been raised in the South. And so as I turned to Mississippi and the Quiet Game, I dealt in a fictional way with the death of Wallace Jackson, but in no real attempt to solve that crime. I used it merely as a jumping off point. But when I began to read Stanley's work later, I was familiar with what had happened to Wallace and Medgar Evers and George Metcalf and the guys who had been instrumental in the movement. We all knew about that. But what Stanley was writing about was just ordinary Black folks who had been caught up and brutalized and murdered in just the course of their daily lives. Just the crime of being Black. That was really the first time I'd come across that. And Stanley was sort of ahead of this modern reckoning that we're in at the time. And like Stanley, I was stunned that I had grown up right in the midst of it, where it had happened, and knew nothing about it. I had never heard these names. I didn't know these people. They had not been covered in the newspaper. My parents, my dad, who knew, was well connected in the Black community, being a physician to mostly Black patient, but he didn't know most of these people, And so I got to know Stanley. I found out about these crimes. And then when you start to find out about the Silver Dollar Group and the psychology of these, what you're talking about today, hatred, race-based hatred, and those things, white fear is what I would really call it now. But
that's a better term, actually.
That was my first window. And once I started seeing where Stanley was going, I said, this is this is what I have to do, and so 250,000 words later, I about had enough, but now I'm back in it with this book. But anyway, that's what got me into it. And Stanley's work, of course, I'm so glad to see Jill here today, and I want to hear about her work, because one of the things that is strange about this whole thing to me, we're living through this racial reckoning about who gets to tell what story, what, all that. And the strange thing to me is when I was brought into it in this second wave, as I wrote the trilogy, it interested me that the people leading the inquiry were middle-aged white guys like you and Stanley, rather than 25-year-old black guys fresh out of right. College or something. And that surprised me. And so it's a complicated situation, that we were in. And now it's changing, I think. Who's telling these stories, exactly. What's being told. But it's, God knows, some people are glad that this is being done, and other people don't want to hear any of this. We're all experiencing that. So I'll shut up now, but I would just want to say that Stanley was an immensely inspiring figure to me. And that's really, I think, what drove me into writing the trilogy, and a lot grew out of that. And I'm glad of that, thankful.
And Stanley, the one thing I did want you to tell us a little bit more about, because people don't know the story, or some of the people watching tonight may not know, is tell the story of Frank Morris, if you don't mind.
Frank Morris operated a shoe shop in Faraday from probably the late 1930s until 1964. He did a real unusual thing during that era, is that he had both a black and white clientele. He also was extremely, aware of the racial mores of the day. For instance, when white women would drive up to his shop, he would walk out to their car and take their order. Just about anybody who wanted to come in the shop could. He also did leather work in the horse business. He'd made bridles and did things like that. And he also provided young black men, I heard from multiple black men now in their 60s and 70s, 80, who talked about they got their first job from Frank Morris. So he was sort of beloved in the community, in both the black and white communities. And in '64, when the Klan came about, Freedom Summer and all of these things happening, there were various rumors as to why Frank Morris was attacked, but I've come to conclude the main reason was that he had had a dispute with Frank DeLauder, this deputy in the parish who was notorious for beating up people and hurting people. And actually, Frank Morris stood up to him one day because Frank DeLauder was notorious for walking into a grocery store and just grabbing from the aisle whatever he wanted and just walking out the door with it, or going to a local, he would extort people. And Frank Morris had the courage one day when DeLauder refused to pay for shoes and for a pair of cowboy boots for a child. He had the courage that no white man ever had to stand up to him and say, "It's not fair to my customers, and I'm not going to do that to you anymore." And I firmly believe, of course, it'll never be proven in court, but I believe that if the Frank Morris was murdered to teach a lesson to him, and I'm not sure the intention was to murder him, but I don't think there was any problem with the fact that he was in the shop that night. There's some indication that they thought maybe he wasn't there that night, but they didn't care. And it was a lesson to him and to the black community, is you do not talk to a law enforcement officer, particularly a white one, that way. A black man cannot talk to a white man that way.
And describe a little bit about what they did to him, if you don't mind.
So Frank is in the back of his shop one night, and we do know that he had a little shack behind his house that he had this longtime employee, and his grandson was living in that little house. Frank would often sleep in the back of the shop. And so one night he was asleep around sometime after midnight, and he heard glass breaking, and he gets up to see what's going on. And he goes around and looks out the front window, and he sees two men. One has a gasoline can and the other one a shotgun, and he can smell gas. And suddenly one of the men throws a match, and the whole building just whoosh like that. Wow. He tries to get to the front door, and when he gets to the front door, The man with a shotgun puts it to his head and says, "Get back in that shop," N-word. Frank has to turn around through the flames, find his way out the back door. When he emerges, 2 Faraday police officers are pulling up on the scene. And it's the middle of the night. It's December. It's cold. And they describe, see, he comes running out and the fire has burned the clothes off of him. He's completely naked. They see one of the policemen describes seeing cloth material, and I don't know what else, but floating in the air like snow. And Frank is just, they put him in their car, take him to the hospital. He lives for 4 days and dies on the 4th day.
And refuses to talk for the 4 days, right?
Well, he does refuse. And Greg, I've come to many different conclusions on a lot of this, because here's what I think is a lot of people believe that Frank Morris knew who the people that did this to him were. I don't think that he knew who those 2 men were in that shop, but I think he did know the source of the reason those 2 men were there. And I think that there was confusion with the FBI, who didn't know Frank and didn't understand the way he talked, because we have a transcript of what was said during 2 or 3 different interviews with him. He kept saying that I don't know who those men were. And I don't believe he did, but he knew.
He knew why.
Most probably the source, the reason that those men were there.
Yeah.
And because he had multiple times while he was in his room, his father and his stepmother sat with him a lot. His best friend went to see him when no one else was in the room and said, "Frank, God, tell me who did this." And he said, "I don't know who did it." Yeah. And I believe firmly that if he truly knew the 2 men that night, that he surely would have told his father.
You would think so. Yeah.
I would think. But, we'll never know for sure. That's my thoughts on that. But it was a tragic time. I often think of him. Frank DeLauder went to see him.
Yeah.
2 or 3 hours after he was in his room.
That's very fascinating.
Yes. And we don't know exactly what was said. I'm sure he could have been threatened, but
could have been threatened.
We'll never know. We'll just never know. There's so many mysteries about that.
Yeah. So Jill, you are no stranger to civil rights cold cases yourself. How did you get involved in these cases? What happened?
So I got involved in 2009. I just graduated from college. I was working in John Lewis's office on Capitol Hill, and he wanted to write a bill that would release FBI records that had been sealed on civil rights cold cases. Mm-hmm. I was working on that bill, and in the process, I reached out to Jerry
That's
to
right.
interview him about the cold cases, and I was just fascinated by what he said. And so when I left Congressman Lewis's office, I called Jerry again and I told him that I wanted to work with him on these cases. Yep. And so Jerry put me in touch with Ben Greenberg. And so I started working with Ben on the Clifton Walker case, the 1964 murder of Clifton Walker.
And tell a little bit about that. That's yet another one of those cases I think a lot of people don't know. Just tell us a little bit about what happened to Clifton Walker.
Yeah, Clifton Walker, his nickname was Man Walker. He was driving home from work at the International Paper Plant in Natchez, Mississippi. Hmm. As he's driving home, he turns on to this little road called Poorhouse Road. It was this little narrow dirt road. Pretty much as soon as he turns down the road, he's ambushed. Men with guns, and they just open fire on his car. They shoot his car up and leave him there to bleed to death. So the next day, someone comes and finds him. He is slumped over His feet are on the floorboard and the driver's side, but he's slumped over on the passenger side, and blood is soaking the seat, blood is soaking the floorboard. And he has his keys, his car keys were in the glove box, and he'd managed to open the glove box, and inside was a .38 Smith & Wesson. He was trying to reach his gun, he never reached it. And so that's a case that was never, ever solved. And the DOJ closed the investigation in 2013, unfortunately.
And am I right? The first thing that the family knew about that the FBI was investigating? Talk about that.
Yeah, the family, interestingly enough, they were not aware that DOJ was even investigating this. No investigators had reached out to them to interview them.
They hadn't talked to them or interviewed them.
And this is important because one of Mr. Walker's children was 14 at the time, and she came to the scene not long after they'd taken his body away. She should have been interviewed, but they never reached out to her. First time finding out that they had even investigated the case was when she got the letter saying that the case was closed.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
And Stanley, I guess you've heard of cases like that too, as well, where families either don't know anything or aren't kept in the loop or aren't interviewed when the FBI kind of went back in and looked at some of these cases.
Yeah, and just real quickly, I'll tell you an example of some of the observations we have about some of these investigations. LSU, we've been working on a case that we recently wrote about. Robert Fuller in Monroe, Louisiana, was a Klansman in 1960. Right. He shot 5 of his black workers, killing 4. He claimed self-defense. And this is a story that he told, and this was a story that was accepted by a grand jury. He said that these men were his employees, that he had trouble with one of the men the day before. They arrived at his house in their car, got out of the car, 5 of them, and charged him with knives. He said he was expecting trouble, so he had his double-barrel shotgun loaded. He claims that as 5 men charged him with knives, that he was able to reload that double-barrel shotgun 3 times and shoot each one of them. Right. This was the story that he told. He had one white witness on the scene, a Mrs. Sherman, who had walked over while he had a gun pointed at the survivor named Charlie Willis, who was on his stomach. Charlie had a gunshot wound in his back, which tells you something.
Yeah, it's not self-defense.
He said, Charlie, you tell Miss Sherman why you boys came here today. And Robert and Charlie says, with a gun pointed at his head, we come to hurt Mr. Robert. Well, Mrs. Sherman told us later she never believed that story, but she became his witness. She heard Charlie Willis say, we come to hurt Mr. Robert. So it goes to the grand jury. The grand jury refuses to indict Fuller, but a short time later, they indict Charlie Willis for the attempted murder of Robert Fuller. He gets a 5-year sentence and ends up serving time in prison. Now, nobody knew about that. We found it. So you knew, we were talking earlier before we began the program today, but talking about the things that you can find in courthouses. We found a lot of materials, but the bottom line was this. We found 2 witnesses, a 95-year-old black woman from Monroe, Miss Willie Mae Sally, who 2 of her brothers were among those killed that day. She knew Charlie Willis, the survivor, well, knew Charlie until he died in the early 1990s. The FBI never talked to her. She said that Charlie Willis told her that when they got out, when they arrived at his house, and what happened was there was trouble the day before, but one of those men, she said, told Robert, and Robert Fuller was notorious for not paying his men. Right. He didn't pay his employees, and they said, we're going to go to the sheriff. Robert Fuller calls that night, because he got furious when he said they were going to go to the sheriff, calls that night, said, okay, fellows, come on to the house in the morning and I'll pay y'all. Well, he set them up. Miss Sally said that when her brother and everybody got out of the car, immediately gunfire opened and there was a second shooter there that day.
Wow.
So we got that story from her. And here's and then so Mrs. Sherman, 95 years old, a white woman, the lady who walked on the scene that day. Right. FBI never interviewed her. She said that after the grand jury, that she went out in the yard one day, they were next door neighbors and they eventually moved away. Said Robert Fuller called her over to him and walked over there and he told her, good thing you walked over when you did, because I was just fixing to kill Charlie Willis when you did.
Wow.
Now, investigative reporting and finding people and doing these cases, this is the reason we do it, because our LSU reporters talked to the sister, the surviving sister of the two of the men that were killed, Miss Willie Mae. The last time we interviewed, she had a hard time talking about this. No one ever asked her any questions. She never even went to her brother's graves all of her life. Wow. Because it was too painful for her.
Right.
She finally got everything out, told everything that she wanted to say. The next day she went to the hospital, and the day after that she died.
Wow.
So that's how fragile these stories and these witnesses, and that's where we are today with all of these cases. We are in a truly, Jerry, a race against time, to use the phrase.
We are.
And for clarity, we're not going to solve probably any more cases, but to find the people that witnessed these things and to get their stories, we can give a pure and accurate account as we can for history.
Yeah.
And that's the work now.
And so, Jill, why do you've worked on these old cases, these cold cases. Why is it important to work on these cases? What do you see?
Yeah, it's incredibly important to work on these cases because, one, they give us clues for the cases that are still happening today.
Right.
So many of the occurrences that you see in those cases, the way that, maybe the police handle the investigation, the way that, maybe the public reacted, everything, it's so similar to how these things are still happening. And I think part of why, these things are still happening is because we still haven't, actually reckoned with what has happened back then,
right.
All of these cases, like the tiny percentage that's been solved, and
right.
these families have been in these communities walking among the people who
right.
murdered their loved ones,
Exactly. And Stanley, what would you say to someone who says, hey, what are you doing digging in? Why do you keep digging into these cases? I'm sure you've heard that from a few folks.
I know I have. From a few folks. Most of the time when people ask you that sort of in a real derogatory way, why are you doing this? Most of the time I find that not only do they not want to read about it or know about it, they don't want anybody else to either. Yes. And that's their fear, is that other people are going to find things out that are true, and some reason they're afraid of the truth. And I don't know why.
And how about you, Greg, on that? I mean, why is writing? Obviously, you spent quite a bit of time writing about this era as well. Why?
Well, interestingly, the book I'm writing right now is set in 2022, but its genesis is 1861, when over 40 enslaved men were lynched around Second Creek in Natchez at the beginning of the war during a white panic and a rumored slave rebellion. And what I wanted to ask you guys, of which you are expert in, but let's be on this just a second. It's like,
that's something I didn't know about, Greg. That's something you just mentioned. I've never heard before.
I didn't either until very recently, and it's of enormous consequence. There's one important historical work written about this, but this is a terrifying thing that happened. But anyway, so it's a case where the powers that existed at the time, the judicial system, served as an arm of white fear and anxiety and terror and repression. in a time where whites were outnumbered in the first year of the war, okay, exactly, and terrified. But I think that's emblematic of what we saw throughout the era of which you guys are expert, which is where there was so often a nexus between law enforcement and the Klan, where law enforcement either facilitated the activities of the Klan or directly were members of the Klan, right, and were serving as an arm of white repression during the period. And terrifyingly so, if you look at things now like the sovereign sheriff movement or the political leanings of what we see in so many law enforcement departments right now, it's a very scary thing about what we may face in 2022 and 2024 if we come to open racial violence in the political activity of this country, which we well may, as January 6th has shown us, you know. So there's a lot to be learned about that. And I wish you guys would talk a little bit about what you've seen about where the authorities that are supposed to be tasked with dispensing justice, both the police and the court system, pervert their purpose to serve the interest of essentially white repression, you know?
Yeah.
And you asked me why talk about that. My God, what else is worth talking about?
Question. It's a great question. I'll let Stanley and Jill, either y'all want to weigh in on what Greg just asked on that.
Well, you know, that's a long pattern there. You had the slave, you had the overseer and the master, the owner. And then after in Reconstruction, you had the rise of the Klan and their quick association with law enforcement. Right. And in the book I just finished on the murder of a Black deputy in the Bogalusa area in 1965, I often think about what would have happened, how worse it would have been, because the white sheriff that hired 2 Black deputies in 1965 had been the target of the Klan for the two previous elections in the 1960 and 1964. Right. And the sheriff, and their whole goal was, particularly in 64, was, we're going to run for every office in the parish, but the real office we want is the sheriff's office because that's where the power is. Exactly. We can control everything in the parish. We can run the civil rights workers out. We can tamp down the local civil rights movement. We can take control of Washington Parish, and then maybe we'll move elsewhere after that. So it was this, and of course, O'Neill Moore lost his life a year after the sheriff hired those 2 Black deputies, which he hired them. He had promised the Black community for their support, he would hire 2 Black deputies, and the Klan didn't believe he would, but he did. And they were shocked, and they vowed that they were going to take them out. And so I think about Washington, what would have happened, you know, and it's always good to find a white person in authority, a sheriff during that era that was actually doing the right thing, some positive right things. But what would have happened in Washington Parish, where in Louisiana there were more Klansmen per capita there than anywhere? What would have happened if the Klan's candidate had won that office in 1964? It would have probably been a lot worse than what it ended up being as it was.
And Bogalusa was like the toughest town in America, I think. Jack Nelson called it or something like that. It was
terrible. And as a result of the killing of O'Neill Moore and the wounding of his partner, Creed Rogers, John Doerr with the Justice Department and Joe Sullivan were on the streets of Bogalusa the days after when everything just exploded. And it was those 2 men witnessing what was going on there with Bogalusa policemen laughing when white men would run out and attack civil rights marchers going down the street. But it was an important thing that those 2 men were there because they realized that Bogalusa could be the real test case for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where the Black activists were petitioning for a chance for hire Black people as policemen. Let us go sit at the counter. And so Doerr filed suit, the government filed suit against Bogalusa, against the police department there. And so in a sense, as a result of what happened to those 2 deputies, we did see where in September of 65, just a few months later, we saw where the 3-judge panel of 5th Circuit New Orleans ruled for the government and against the Klan. and began to monitor everything that they were doing in Bogalusa. So that's the way it turned out. But had Sheriff Crow not been reelected and this Klan candidate went into office, I don't know what would have happened in Washington Parish.
Is a scary place, Bogalusa, in those days, that's for sure. And I do want to remind people you can put, which I should have mentioned earlier, you can put your questions into the chat or the Q&A, either one, and we'll be taking those up. So we've got questions for any of our panelists. But Jill, tell us, we've been talking about a little bit about the past, and as Greg kind of really pointed out correctly, this continues to influence the present in lots of ways. So talk about the case you're working on right now.
Yeah, and what Greg said, that's a perfect segue. Because actually, in the Clifton Walker case, there was one of the investigators with the Mississippi Highway and Safety Patrol was also a member of the Klan.
Yeah.
At least one.
Yep.
And so this is, it's embedded in these cases almost with this, and this has not stopped. I've been looking at modern day lynchings that started like the year 2000 and after, and primarily in Mississippi, across the country, but especially focusing on Mississippi. And there have been at least 8 modern day lynchings since 2000. Those are only the names that we know. Mm-hmm. I suspect that there are actually hundreds more. Mm-hmm. Every time I go to investigate a case, people are telling me, did you hear about this other person who got killed? Right. There are so many stories that are not being told, so many cases that are just being swept under the rug. And in these situations, we have, like, for example, right now, I've been working on the Clifton Walker, the Willie Andrew Jones Jr. case. Willie was 21 years old. In 2018, he was found hanging from a tree outside his white girlfriend's front yard in Scott County, Mississippi. The police arrived on the scene. They did not secure the scene. And within 40 minutes of Willie's mother arriving on the scene, a sheriff's department investigator told her that it was suicide. It was nothing else. They hadn't even spoken to witnesses at that point.
Right.
What preceded was a suicide investigation, basically, and even when the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation was brought in to investigate, foul play, basically what they did was still conduct a suicide investigation. We've listened to the audio of all these interviews, we've read all of these files, and the questions that they're asking are directly pertaining to just whether or not he killed himself in these cases. And this, it's not just Willie's case, we think about the Raynard Johnson case from 2000, basically that case was just basically ground to a halt because, the family said that the belt that Raynard was hung with was not his belt. And then there was surveillance video that was found with him wearing a similar belt. And so the DOJ was basically like, oh, this was his belt, so he committed suicide, and, like he can't actually be lynched with his own belt.
Right.
And so these cases, what I've seen.
You would think he would be, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
You would think they might use his own bill.
Yes.
That's what's going on. Wow.
And so from the 60s cases to now, these cases, the investigations by state actors and by federal actors are cursory at best. When we came in to investigate Willie's case, I started investigating the case in 2019, and we found so many things that the police never even knew about. They hadn't even spoken to some of the key witnesses. There was a witness who heard Willie fighting for his life minutes before he was killed. The cops never even interview this person. We got surveillance video and we tracked the times when things were happening, and we found out that the timeline that the people that, it was wrong.
Right.
We found out that Willie had an arm injury that would have prevented him from tying the knots in the rope to kill himself, to actually hang himself. There's so many things. But
I have a question about these, Jeff, I can ask you. But
yeah, sure.
These kind of cases, does it tend to start immediately with the patrolman investigators on the scene? Where do the DAs in these counties stand? Do they also resist it being anything but suicide, from the start? No, so nobody really in the chain says, let's look at this. Everybody wants to just say suicide, forget it. It's nothing, right?
Yeah, especially, I would say there is the appearance of looking. Like in Willie's case, bringing in the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation to conduct their own investigation. But basically what their investigation was, if you look at their report, it's basically Scott County's police report. That's what their investigation was. And so, yeah, like you have these situations where the DAs, and I can especially, since Willie's case is like present mind, I was working on that today. You have a situation where if, like the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation says, no, we don't want to reopen this, or we do believe this is suicide, then the DA will just say, all right, let's go along with that. It's utterly ridiculous.
And something to be pointed out in terms of police investigation in general about these things is if you have what you suspect is a suicide, right? You should always treat it as a homicide, like presume. I mean, the problem is if you just say, oh, it's a suicide, and you just kind of, then you're not going to get to the bottom of these things, whereas if you, I know some other cases that I'm aware of in terms of that, it's kind of like, and two, with law enforcement, at times, they can be kind of myopic, like it's whatever the first person going onto the scene or the commander or whatever goes, oh yeah, that's what this is, and there's no re-looking at that or looking at other evidence or anything like that. That's been my experience. Could you tell me about?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, in a lot of these cases, so much is based on assumption.
Right.
So looking at Willie's case, basically the sheriff said, yeah, he committed suicide because one, his feet were on the ground. And two, the family sometimes had Black people over, so they couldn't be racist. These are the assumptions that he based this off of, and the person who gave the entire narrative, the dominating narrative of that case was given by one of the lynchers, and the police never even questioned it.
Wow.
It's incredibly fascinating and baffling and sad. And it shows why it's important that we have to independently investigate these cases.
And what's the latest legally with the case? I know you went into Hinds County, is it where you went into?
Yes. So where we are now is that we are going to be, we're working to get charges brought against the lynchers. What we very much want is for Scott County to do the right thing.
Right.
Honestly, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And so what we're going to have to do is make them do the right thing. And so in terms of litigation, we're looking to file another motion. And I can't speak a lot about that right now, but the fight is far, far from over. And I really believe that by the end of this, we will have justice, because there's no way that we're going to stop until we do.
Very good. Stanley, I got an obvious question to ask you. Why is investigative reporting important?
Well, I think because what we just talked, one thing I was mentioning about the Robert Fuller case, where we discovered these two witnesses who had never been talked to before. And I just want to mention one thing. The cold cases that I have worked on, we think about, and we tend, including myself, we tend to blame the FBI and DOJ for everything, right? But in every parish, in every county where these murders occur, there has been sheriff after sheriff and DA after DA who inherited these cold cases and never lifted a finger to do anything. So it's the way the communities, if there was community pushes, the thing about it is, like me with Frank Morris, not even having known who he was until that 2007 DOJ makes the announcement. A lot of people may truly not be aware, but it is every law enforcement's responsibility if a crime occurred, a cold case in their community, it's theirs to do. So when they don't do the work, we do the work, and we try to figure out what happened. And it's important, I guess, one reason investigative reporting is important is because at least we're out there trying to do the work that nobody else is doing. And because otherwise it would not be done at all. I can say, Jerry, many of the cases that you covered, had you not stayed with these cases and did the work, a lot of men, a lot of Klansmen would have died at home rather than in jail because they would have gotten away with it. So, and investigating reporting is not easy. It's hard because it takes a long time sometimes to get somebody to talk to you. It takes a while to find people. It takes a long time to go find documents that you need. It's hard work. I enjoy the work, but it's really, really hard. But it makes a difference in people's lives. Miss Willie Mae, who I talked about in Monroe, whose two brothers, she was just, I think, sort of maybe not overwhelmed, but just grateful. Like Rosa Williams was telling me that, no one had ever cared about these cases before, and they just can't believe it when somebody actually is out there trying to find something out. And so without investigative reporting, there's so many things that communities would not know that they deserve to know and that they want to know. And we've been able to shed some light and provide some historic perspective, which we need. And in some cases, like in your work, we're able to see justice. And I think justice is less likely now in the civil rights era cases, but there's still a whole lot of history to write. And I think that's our job.
Well, certainly you're collecting evidence, like you mentioned in some of the cases, what you're doing. I mean, you're getting evidence from witnesses and other things like that otherwise it would be lost. It just would be lost forever if you weren't collecting this information.
And I think we're retrieving records that are buried in courthouse basements that probably would just crumble to the dust one day if we didn't go and find them.
Yeah, exactly. They would be lost too. All that would be lost. What about that, Greg? What do you think? What do you see? What do you think investigative reporting is important? And if so, why?
Yeah. And I'm going to give a big answer, not a long answer. And it's that, when Barack Obama was elected, there were whispers and talk that America had reached we've reached a post-racial America. And I wondered if the trilogy would be irrelevant. No greater irony or misunderstanding was ever stated or even whispered in this country. And what we've seen is not only was that wrong, but we've seen that the sins for which the South was excoriated for all those years are not endemic to the South, but are shared throughout all of white America. And this whole reckoning that they say we're going through remains out in front of us, unresolved. And I find both depression and hope in that. And the depression is, in any way that we deal with this as groups, as Americans, right now, I see very little hope. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But what I have found with my novels and with Stanley's work and your work, and what I see is even with white folks that come from what I'd call the other side, moderately racist, or even would admit to that, when you give them the details of these human stories, just one-on-one, Frank Morris, these people we're talking about, you just tell them the details of their lives and what happened to them and how they were mistreated. Everybody gets it, one-on-one, there's hope there. It's like, man, we're not that different, Exactly. But sadly, that's not what dominates the narrative, and people's fear and resistance makes them push away and get political. That's the sad part. But in terms of what all of you do, the real professionals here, that is the value. And that's the reason you never stop. You know, you got to bring the truth, the small details, the belt, the girlfriend, the motive, the psychology, put it in terms people can understand. And then maybe we get a little closer, you know?
And you know, Jerry, I think Greg is right, because when I started writing about Frank Morris, the one thing I was concerned about was the polarizing issue of race.
Right.
How do I get people to see who Frank Morris was? And I just sort of decided, you know, just write about who he was every week as you tell his story, because when people could see Frank Morris as a human being and not as just this black man on a long list that the DOJ has, exactly. and can see that Frank Morris was a good man, that he did good work in the community, he was important to the community, that he did nothing whatsoever to deserve what happened to him. Right. If you can get people to see it that way, and Greg's absolutely right, you have to put Frank Morris has to become a human being, yes, and not thought of just as a dead black man. You got to see who he is.
I think that's real key, Stanley. I think that's because I think it's to weigh in myself on one point here. I think that's so key, because when we fail to see each other, regardless of skin color, in a dehumanizing way, like, you know, so-and-so is a monster, or some racial group is a monster, or, you know, some group is a monster, or whatever it is politically or whatever, then people feel like they're justified in hating or even doing something to them because they're doing society a favor. If somebody's a monster and I do something toward them, I'm doing society a favor, right? You know, but you're right. It's that humanity. They begin, and I'm sure you've heard back from people after having written about all, you know, turning Frank Morris into a three-dimensional person and letting people really know about it.
And one thing was, and Greg and I have talked about this a lot, and this was a real big motive, believed to be a motive. I no longer believe it was I think it was a Klan rumor that Frank Morris was allowing white men and black men to have white women and black men to have sex in the back of his shop.
Yeah,
and come to find out that it was the police, the law and the Klansmen who put that rumor out.
Exactly.
But here's the thing was, because that is an electrified issue at any time.
That moment in time, that was
boom. And so the white community would sort of think this, you know, Frank Morris was a good man. I did business with his shop. Terrible what happened to him, but he should have known better than to let that go on in his shop, as if he was somehow would be at fault for what happened to him.
Well, yeah, and it's unproven. You know, like you said, it sounds like a Klan rumor.
Let me throw in one thing there. One of the most humanizing things I ever heard, and Stanley, I hope this isn't a breach of confidence. Stanley played me a little bit of an informant tape where a woman had called in about Frank and about the rumors that he was overly flirtatious with black women and stuff. And so white women would pull up in front of the store and he would go out and take their shoes or whatever. And this woman, she was clearly 85 or 90 when she made the call, but she called in to describe what a nice and polite gentleman Frank had always been. And she said, and I tell you what, I wasn't a bad looking woman back then, but he treated me just
I love it.
Treated me just like a gentleman, you know. It was
That's funny. That's funny. Well, Jill, bring us home on this. What role do you see investigative reporting, you know, playing in, you know, these kinds of cases and beyond?
Yeah, I see investigative reporting playing an incredibly key role. I mean, I see investigative reporting being just as important as the attorney's job, because you guys are the ones who are double checking, you know, what the findings are. So many things we would never know the truth if, you know, if you guys didn't find that, you know, and not just finding it, but telling the stories. That puts pressure on these actors who are so hesitant to do anything about it. So I see it as honestly a partnership in justice between investigative journalists, between attorneys, doing this work. It's incredibly important.
It certainly can be, that's for sure, in terms of, working on, it looks like we do have one question. There's from Michael. Anyway, someone talking about, getting traction for stories and stuff like that. And it is tough sometimes to get traction for stories. You write about things and,
yes,
sometimes it is
hard.
It can be very hard. So
incredibly hard.
Well, you guys are telling the story a lot of people don't want to hear. That's the bottom line. A lot of people just want to look the other way, man. They don't want
that's true. I think what I've found in general, and this is whether you're talking about this kind of reporting or other reporting, there's a young reporter in Hot Springs, and I just kept writing about this, basically corruption involving a theme park. And some guy and these bonds that they floated, that they basically didn't spend the bond money like they were supposed to. And so this hotel owner in Hot Springs wound up suing. And when I called him, I said, well, what made you, because I was writing a story like every day almost about this. And he goes, what made you decide to sue? He goes, I got tired of reading about in the paper. I always loved that. I always said that. Hey, this stuff works. So finally it gets through. But I want to thank everybody. Thank our panelists, Jill and Stanley and Greg, and want to thank our co-sponsors, Millsaps College and Michael Stamey for running our show, Mississippi Book Festival, Lemuria Books, and thank our entire staff, my co-founder, Ian Isaacs, our managing editor, Debbie Skipper, our reporter in residence, Anne-Marie Cunningham. And as I mentioned earlier, you can find all our great stories on MississippiCIR.org. And if you support our work this month, you actually can get your donation tripled. So pretty exciting. So anyway, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and appreciate
Jill, keep up that good work. I'm glad I got to meet you.
Thank you so much, Greg.
And Greg's book will be coming. We don't
next year.
Next
year. Don't pin me to a date, but next year.
I won't hold you to a date, but sometime next year. And it is a pen cage novel.
It's a pen cage number 7. It's called Southern Man, and it is slightly ironic title, but we'll see.
Yeah. Did you take that from the Neil Young?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
And I had a feeling you did. And I did post the link to our website up on the up on the chat as well. So if you want to check that out, appreciate it. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Good night.
Bye.